We turn now to the African nation of Ethiopia, to the question of whether there is any relief from its twin burdens of famine and civil war following the departure yesterday of President Mengistu Haile Mariam. He fled just as the parties in the country's civil war were preparing for another round of peace talks next week in London. For years, separatist rebels in the northern provinces of Tigray and Eritrea have been fighting the central government and now are poised to assault the area around the capital of Addis Ababa. Our coverage begins with a report from Lyndon McIntyre of the CBC Fifth Estate program.
This is the village of Nanoharbo. Sadisu Fayesa has lived here for 3 years. The challenge of feeding her 5 children becomes more daunting with the arrival of each new day. Like most of the people in Nanoharbo, Sadisu did not come to live here by choice. She's part of a massive exercise in Marxist economic manipulation. After the famine of 1984, the government of Ethiopia forced a quarter of the rural population to move into 65,000 new villages like Nanoharbo. The villages have become concentrations of rural poverty in a country that is among the poorest on earth. She's trapped here. Her old home in the countryside was destroyed after she left. To return and build a new one is impossible for her. Her husband is among hundreds of thousands of Ethiopian men who have been conscripted to fight in the civil war. Sadisu has 5 children. The eldest daughter, who is 10, looks after the rest while their mother does the chores. There is no school in Nanoharbo. Each villager has 1 hectare of land for growing food. The land is dry and sterile, and the men who might be farmers are soldiers instead. Sadisu's mother-in-law lives in despair for her 2 sons.
They came at night to pick up my son for the war. He did not want to let them in, but they forced the door. I could do nothing. I would have just killed myself. I received his last letter 2 years ago. He was asking me to take care of his children, as I used to do in the past. I wrote him back, I can't even help myself. So how can I help your children? This is Sadisu's husband. And this is my other son who died in the war.
The war has been going badly for the government of Ethiopia for the past 3 years. This was one of the government's most devastating defeats. Massawa, an important Red Sea port in Eritrea. Deadly street combat lasted 3 days in February last year. A rebel army crushed one of the largest and best equipped military forces in Africa. The defeat of government forces at Massawa was a crucial turning point for the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, the EPLF, in a 30-year struggle for independence from Ethiopia. They now control all of Eritrea except the capital, Asmara, and 1 other seaport, Assab. The Ethiopian army was falling apart. At Massawa, 8,000 government soldiers, most of them conscripts, surrendered to the rebels. Many of them had to be released. The rebels couldn't afford to feed them. As they trudged homeward, there was little to look forward to. Hungry families and a continuing war which consumes 70% of the national budget, and an unpopular government with no ideas for ending either the famine or the war.
The U.S. policy is that we think Ethiopia should remain united. We believe in the African OAU principle that colonial borders should be maintained, and that there's no viability in partitioning Ethiopia.
Herman Cohen is U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Africa. He told Ethiopia Americans would help to keep the country together and how to qualify for that help.
Well, when I saw President Mengistu in August of 1989, he said, well, what do you need to have better relations with us? And I gave him a list. I said, we'd like to see you get away from the Marxist system. We'd like to see a better human rights performance. We'd like to see better economic performance. And most of all, we'd like to see some peace process getting underway.
Last year, under pressure, Mengistu decreed a return to the free market system in a 5-hour speech to his people. Farmers were no longer required to live in villages. They could own land and grow crops and sell directly in markets like this one in the capital, Addis Ababa. His ministers called it perestroika. But in his marathon speech on reform, Mengistu never mentioned the one reform most Ethiopians want to see: political pluralism and democracy, ultimately free elections, which would enable them to get rid of him. At this feeding center, there was even more evidence that the reforms aren't working. These people are on the brink of death. Last October, this center, which distributes food from Canada, treated 10 children per day. They were feeding 100 each day in February. Usually, they try to restore children to 85% of their normal weight. Now they're sending them away when they reach 65%. This little girl's name is Munini Muni. She's 7 years old. She and others like her no longer have the strength or the will to take food. Mary Murphy is medical coordinator for the aid group Concern. She's been in Ethiopia for 2 years, a witness to a deteriorating situation.
People are eating barely enough to carry them through the day. For example, where they were eating 3 meals, they're now eating 2, or where they were eating 2, they are now only eating 1. Medicines is one of the biggest problems we have. And basically, while we know medicines are being distributed from the capital, between the capital and actual arrival here, a lot of medicines are going astray.
Most of the women who bring their children here are widows or single parents whose husbands have vanished into the bottomless pit of war. They and the people who work here know that this is only a reprieve, a brief pause in the hopelessness that awaits them when they go back home.
I suppose at the end of the day, the important thing is the people, not the governments, not the aid agencies, and not the television crew, but the people who are living in the Kibbelis. And as such, they need food today. There's no good waiting until tomorrow or next month to start an intervention program. Whether the government agrees or whether we agree, that has nothing to do with it. We've got to get out there, get the food to the people today.
These parents lost one child in the famine of 1984. This time things are even worse.
In 1984, some people had money, so they could get food from the market even if it were expensive. Now, we have no money and no food.
Each day, they spend all their waning energy foraging for something to eat, or in the case of these coffee beans, something to sell.
We have nothing, no food for today. We will send our son to sell coffee beans at the market and bring back food. We are worried for the future.
We get 2 more perspectives now. Kuflo Wodaju was Ethiopia's ambassador to Washington from 1971 to 1973 and was foreign minister from 1974 to 1977. Before President Mengistu took power, he is now a consultant. and Michael Clough is a senior fellow for Africa at the Council on Foreign Relations. And starting with you, Mr. Kufla, you just heard this woman talk about being worried about her future. How do you see it in the wake of Mengistu's departure? Is it any brighter?
A major problem has been lifted. The role of Mengistu in Ethiopia's political life has been a stumbling block. For the last several years, government opponents have argued that without the removal of Mengistu, there cannot be serious talk about finding a solution to the country's political problem. So in a sense that that he's now out of the picture, at least all of us could focus on how we can move from where we are now to some improved situation.
Is there any sense that his departure will have any practical effect just in terms of getting food to the people? Because the fighting has been, aid workers have been talking about concern over the fighting now preventing relief getting to 5-6 million people who are facing starvation.
Well, it would certainly help to remove this central issue, the issue being Mengistu's role in, as I said earlier, in the political life of Ethiopia. Now, with his removal, perhaps there is a better chance for a negotiated settlement of the conflict with perhaps a ceasefire or with a resolution of the conflict. The problem of famine will still be with us, but at least with regard to distribution of relief, the situation will be much improved.
Michael Clough, in terms of the political, do you see any hope at this point that a ceasefire or any kind of political settlement is imminent?
Well, I think it all depends on what Mengistu's departure really means. If Mengistu's departure means that the government is prepared to meet many of the demands of the EPLF and the TPLF, who are now on the ascendance militarily, then I think we've got a chance.
That's the Eritrean People's Liberation Army and the Tigray People's Liberation Army.
Right. If, on the other hand, this is simply a maneuver by the government to try to get international support to sort of redress the balance on the ground militarily, to hope that the diplomatic effort will stop the war, then I think this could be just the beginning of a much more serious conflict.
And there are reports today that relief officials are worried that if this conflict spreads, that efforts to get food to these people will be severely hampered.
Well, I think obviously there will be severe effects on the relief operations, but the more serious immediate effect or danger is the prospect of a battle for Addis Ababa that could end up killing thousands of people, much in the same way that civil wars in Liberia and Somalia led to battles for the capital city where many people were died. And I think that's what's foremost on most people's mind in terms of humanitarian concerns.
Mr. Kufla Waduja, you've been in touch with people on the ground in Addis, and late today, the acting president appealed Wednesday night for a ceasefire, saying that if there wasn't, Ethiopia was facing an indescribably bitter civil war. What's your sense of that? Do you have any information as to what is likely to happen there over the next few days?
Well, the situation is far from clear. The government, the new administration, is not an administration which has any chance of governing. I don't think they themselves feel that they have the mandate nor the public support to govern. They know that they have a specific and limited role, and that is to transfer the powers of government to a negotiated transitional government. So in that sense, there is a good opportunity. The government has already said that in London, and the negotiations which will open in London Monday, they are prepared to agree to some of the demands of the opposition for the establishment of a transitional government in which the opposition will have a major say, or we don't know what relative share the government or groups which were part of Mengistu's government will have. But just the same, they view their role as being very limited, both in time and also with respect to responsibility.
What about the fears stirring apparently in the capital of a bloodbath? The rebels have said they would not take the fighting to the streets of the capital, and yet all reports today out of Addis were saying that there was fear of a bloodbath. You think that's justified?
Well, the opposition groups have said that the government's call for a ceasefire is unacceptable to them.
Unacceptable?
Yes, that's what they have said. At least their spokesmen in London and elsewhere have said that. But the leaderships of those groups have not made yet formal statements to that effect. Perhaps this is a maneuver for increased bargaining leverage. But just the same, their military advances towards the capital have continued on all directions, on all three directions from the capital.
Mike Clough today, one of the rebel radio stations, urged relief agencies to resume shipments of aid and promised to provide every protection, and they called on the Ethiopian Air Force not to drop bombs on the relief convoys. Are they more sensitive to the possibility of this drought and famine facing the people in the provinces?
Well, I think it's important to realize that both of the guerrilla movements, both the Tigrayans and the Eritreans, have themselves run large-scale relief efforts in their areas, and so they have a record of trying to provide relief. I think in a funny sort of way, a battle for Addis Ababa might actually make it easier to provide relief around the rest of the country, because of course a lot of this relief doesn't come through Addis Ababa. It comes through ports, some of it comes in through Sudan, and so in a sense the greatest fear we have, the battle for Addis Ababa, might also in the short run make the delivery of relief supplies less of a problem.
Because the problem has been the fighting that is held up
and also I would
around the ports and various other
exactly and right now my guess would be that the Ethiopian army outside of Addis Ababa is very much in disarray. The request for the Air Force not to bomb, well, I'm not sure what the Air Force right now would even think its chain of command was, given Mengistu's departure and the negotiations on Monday. So from that standpoint, it may be a more hopeful situation.
Mr. Kufla, Wadaju mentioned the talks on Monday that are supposed to go forward in London. Those are U.S. brokered talks. How much leverage does the United States have on the situation at this time?
I don't think we have a lot. In fact, one of the things that I worry about, particularly from the excerpt from Assistant Secretary Cohen about one of our objectives being to maintain a unified Ethiopia, if by that he means that the United States is essentially going to back an effort to try to resist the demands of the Eritreans for independence and to draw the TPLF into a central government without some degree of autonomy, I think that could be a very dangerous precedent. I think hopefully what the United States will concentrate on is, as Mr. Wadaje said, getting a transitional government in place that's representative of all three of the forces, plus the other groups that don't actually have guerrilla armies, and getting on to the process of redefining an Ethiopia that can permanently end the prospect of war, as opposed to create a short-term stopgap measure.
Mr. Wadaje, are you optimistic that, I know you said the situation is so fluid right now, but what's your sense of the possibility now of a permanent ceasefire and a permanent settlement to this conflict?
The first requirement, I believe, is to arrest the present momentum, the military momentum, the present momentum which, as your other guest suggested, might bring the armies of the rebels to Addis Ababa.
And who has the power to do that? I mean, does the U.S. have the leverage in any way to affect that?
I believe the U.S. has tremendous leverage. I think more leverage than it realizes, because the U.S., whoever emerges victor from these conflicts, will have the responsibility of feeding its people. And the only potential provider massive humanitarian assistance is the U.S. And Western Europe. Together, between the U.S. and Western Europe, there is a tremendous leverage in terms of economic aid.
Right.
Also, the U.S. recognition of a victor is a political, confers a certain amount of legitimacy. Western recognition of any victor confers a great measure of legitimacy, and this itself is also a great leverage.
All right. Well, Mr. Wodaju and Michael Clough, thank you for joining us.
Again, the major stories of this Wednesday. The widow of India's former Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi was chosen to lead his political party. Gandhi was assassinated yesterday at a campaign rally. And Secretary of State Baker said his Mideast peace efforts were not progressing as quickly as he had hoped. He said Israel's West Bank settlements were the biggest obstacle to peace. Good night, Charlene.
Good night, Jim. That's our NewsHour for tonight. I'm Charlene Hunter-Gault. Thank you and good night.
Funding for the NewsHour has been provided by AT&T. AT&T connects the world. From equipment to networking, from computers to communications, AT&T, the right choice. And by PepsiCo. And made possible by the financial support of viewers like you and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
This is PBS.